Only by going through this process we've begun to describe can we get back to the essence of the sensory experience and essentially re-find ourselves. Can we begin to then relate to what is essential to us as we know ourselves to be before all of the social imposition? It's the reality of beginning to once again have your experience, not the experience that you were taught and told to have. And it relieves all of this existential angst. It relieves all of the ontological angst. It relieves the mythological angst. Because all of a sudden now what you're experiencing, you recognize again to be real, and you can respond to it for what it is, not what it was, not what you want it to be, and not what you're told it should be, could be, might be, or even is. It simply is what it is. And if you don't like spinach, you get to choose not to eat it, even if it's good for you.
When Nietzsche started growing his mustache, it was small too. Welcome back. And I hope you can observe that with all this talk of heroic journeys, my testosterone levels have increased, and it seems that I'm more and more heroic all the time in terms of like sprouting hair. Is that a thing?
I think I would say that it probably has to do with the whole existential nature of your broadcast and the Friedrich Nietzsche look that you developed there with that, you know.
If I go with Nietzsche, it means it's going to continue moving out into the world.
You get it. So I mean, it's you definitely have assumed the personality quite well. So we can say that you're very Nietzschean these days. And,
well, thank you for your blessing.
Absolutely. And I think if at some point you want to adopt a little simian, the chest hair would give it a pleasant place to rest its head. So I think it's also specian as well as existential.
So it sounds like overall I'm headed in a very positive direction.
Absolutely. Hair growth is always a positive thing, as those of us who have little can attest to.
Wonderful. So I was hoping we could discuss in greater depth today the Easter egg that you left us at the last interview. And I'll rephrase the words that you said just so we can use those to jump off from. You spoke of the resolution of the great trauma. And you said that people experience traumas and those traumas become a part of their flesh. And for them to heal and find their true mythological self, that trauma thorn has to be removed in order to facilitate that. I was hoping we could look at that topic further today. And I think I will remove some of my existential
your Nietzschean coverage.
Yes.
We're gonna put Friedrich aside for the moment.
This is my baby Nietzsche here. Okay, let me just rip this thing off.
If you're gonna pick a mythological form, Friedrich Nietzsche is not a bad one. You know, it's okay. If we're going to be doing existential talks, you know.
Wonderful.
Yeah, one of the things Nietzsche definitely had a thorn in his side for his whole life. He was highly traumatized around many things, it seems, and he spoke of some of them, not all of them. But one of the things that was surely interesting, he often said about his own philosophical ramblings, let's call them, really a word I steal from Wittgenstein, but applying it to Frederick first. And he said that he was always a man ahead of his time, that he was not actually writing for the people that were present, but for the future generations who would understand his work.
Wow.
Right? So he kind of understood we live in a kind of mythological social milieu, which allows us to make sense of the world through the mythology that we partake of. And part of that mythology is socially constructed, of course, and socially installed, right? So it's passed on, you know. We can imagine 100,000 years ago that it was all orally passed on. So people were telling stories around the campfire, or when they were, on their own in whatever habitation they had established, whether that was out in the open air or it was in a cave or they had built some shelter. There was this storytelling that we can imagine was happening, right? The stories of the people, the stories of the family, the stories of the animals, the forest, the things that made sense to them for getting along. And in that time, the thing that we also talked about a little bit was there was an essential integration, an alignment, you can say, between the stories that were being told and the experience of the individual. So they were deeply immersed in that milieu of the social mythological form that they'd been born into. And for all intent and purpose, they may not have ever moved more than, let's say, 10 kilometers, 10 miles from their birthing place. And that might have been their whole world, right? From birth to death. Today, we do that in a few minutes because of the transportation changes we have and the way the world is organized around us. And many of us, I'm one of them, have circled the globe more than once or twice because we get on these, flying machines that take us all over in time that's incomprehensible in human terms, right? That's really interesting. In fact, one of the things that I always found interesting, there's a story that you could say is told about the people who are in these more primitive environments. They've never experienced before the encounter with an automobile. Now, we're not talking necessarily last week. We're maybe talking, 10, 20, 50, 60, 80 years ago, whatever it was. But at some point in time, we can argue there were people in the world who had never seen an automobile. And one of the, I don't know if it's anecdotal or real stories that comes through, is that some people were invited to sit on the back of a pickup truck. And they were being moved from one place to another in a place where these people had literally never experienced automobiles before. And they couldn't comprehend that the pickup truck was going 30, 40 miles an hour, whatever it was going, 20 miles an hour. And when it came time for them in their mind to get off the pickup truck, they just stepped off the back of the truck. And of course, they went tumbling down the road. They didn't get killed or anything. They probably got bruised up and beat up a little bit. But there was no way for them to make sense of how fast the vehicle could go, right? Because it felt to them so stable, and they had no visual, reference, no proprioceptive references for moving at that speed. So, they just stepped off and assumed when they hit the ground, it would be as stable as they felt while they were sitting on the truck, right? Wasn't the case. So one of the things we have to learn to incorporate is the idea of sensorial experience and the interpretation of sensorial experience. What does it mean to have the sensory-based experiences we're having? And what I meant by these thorns were that when I was working with Roy, there was an idea that he introduced to me of the sensitizing imprint. And the sensitizing imprint was this interruption, you can call it, when a person is in a sense of stability and even ecstasy about their relationship to the environment that they're in. So they're experiencing whatever they're experiencing. They're having their sensory experience. And in having their sensory experience, one of the things that occurs is they're making sense of it from within that experience. And when it's well integrated and well aligned, there isn't anything else going on. There's just the experience they're having. And then, as an example, there's a little child and they're immersed in the wonder of rooting through some leaves, and there's an earthworm they find, and the earthworm is wiggling, and it's totally fascinating them. They're totally captured and captivated by this thing. And all of a sudden, with no malicious intention whatsoever, mom or dad calls out dinner time and breaks the reverie. And now there's a sensitizing imprint, that total immersion, that total sense of alignment and integration with one's experience in the moment is interrupted. And the way Roy would explain this is over time, these sensitizing imprints accumulate. And they accumulate in such a way that the individual begins to protect themselves from the break from that sense of ecstasy. So they kind of hide their most natural self. They put it in a place where it's protected so it can't be bruised again and again and again. And they remain out in the world in such a way that they don't go into that deep alignment, that deep integration space, so that they can remain present to what's going on around them that involve others. So they begin to, you could say, subdue or submerge their own states of ecstasy and absolute purity of experience so that they can remain present to the shared experience of the social structure of the individuals around them that they have to respond to or that they're being called upon to respond to. So that's one aspect of how these traumas build, is via the sensitizing imprints that occur, these experiences that are interruptive, we can call it, and force this natural experience, this deep, integrated, aligned experience into submersion.
Can I ask you to clarify why Ray called it a sensitizing imprint? Because in my mind, as you're describing it, it could almost be said to be a desensitizing imprint.
Because the imprint, the experience of what happens in that moment of interruption, impresses itself upon you. You become sensitized to the idea that it will happen again. You become sensitized to the reality that what you experience, which is again, absolute pure sensorial presence and the ecstasy that comes with that, it will be interrupted. So you become sensitive to it. In the same way you become sensitive to a food that you're allergic to, right? That's the word we use. So he meant the word sensitive in that way. We become sensitive to the idea that we have to be cautious in regard to these interruptions that happen. And so we have to protect ourselves from them. So that, somebody who's allergic to strawberries sees strawberries and avoids them, right? Somebody who's had a number of these sensitizing imprints knows, oh, when I get, captured or I become captivated in this way, it's the most likely time that my state of ecstasy will be interrupted. So I've got to be careful even about going into it, to the point where I choose not to go into it because the interruption is so disquieting. Right? And now I've submerged my own, let's call them intuitions or instincts, if you prefer, to be present in the world and responding to it at this sensorial level, to the preference to be present to the social experience and the awareness of others, and how they will impress themselves upon me, whether that's intended or desired or useful to me or not. Right?
Could we also call that like programming to conform?
Well, it's absolutely the way that programming to conform happens. It's one of the ways that it happens, for sure. Right. And we can say that this is one of those mythological forms that Joseph Campbell speaks to us about. The mythological form that's designed to get us to become aware of and present to the norms of society.
And how does he speak of that mythological form specifically?
Well, he says there's 4 functions of mythology. And one of the functions of mythology is to train people in the shared sociological forms, the way that one is expected to behave and perform in the social environment that they're born into. Right? The other 3, again, just to refresh everybody's mind, if you will, are the cosmological form, the sense of the mystery of the universe, the sense of one's individual presence, who one is, identity, you can call it, the idea that myth shares a way of a pathway of getting to yourself. That's the hero's journey experience, actually, is what that identity myth is about. And the other one are the functional myths, the ones that teach you how to do things. So how to build a fire, the myths of, where the water is in the desert. These are stories that are told that carry a functional intention. So you've got the social, the functional, the cosmological, and the individual, right? And these are the 4 functions of myth as Joseph Campbell lays them out. So the social form is the one that we pay attention to, that allows us and teaches us how to integrate with the society that we're born into and that surrounds us, the one we're immersed in, right? So for us, there's 2 things I would say. One is, I'm going to go back to Joseph Campbell, and then I'll add something else in. The one that goes back to Joseph Campbell is that we're immersed in the social form, like a fish is immersed in water. A fish does not notice, you could say, that it's in water. Water is what it exists in. There isn't, an external reality beyond the water, you could say, for the fish that represents its existence. So even if it knows there's a surface, and when it goes to the surface, it goes out of the water, the same way we notice when we go into the water, it doesn't matter. There's no sense of our existence at being present under the water for any extended period of time, right? We can go there and bathe, but eventually we're going to stick our heads up so we can breathe, because we exist in air, in the atmosphere, in the same way that fish exist in water, right? So in some regard, that's what society is for us. We exist in society in such a way that we don't notice it. It's just the background of our experience that's ever present and irreconcilable in the sense that there's anything other than that we can have the experience of. We are part of and immersed in and contained by the social form. Right? The thing that I was going to add in is that in many ways that social form is constructed, it's contained, and it's sustained by what we call language. Right? When the Wachowski brothers came out and produced the movie The Matrix, it became very clear to me, given all the work I've done up to you could say 20 years prior to that movie being released, that The Matrix is language. Mm-hmm. Language is what we're caught by. We're in this fetal position in a little pod that's held in place by language, and we serve it, and we think it serves us, but in reality, we keep it going by our devotion to it, right? To the point where for most people, and this is very tied into the work that I do in the MythoSelf process when I'm working with clients, I help them to recognize how language has superseded reality for them. So the words they use, the things that they apply labels to, it becomes more important to them that the label defines what the thing is than the thing itself. So we see all kinds of things. I mean, just a simple example would be the labels we give to eating patterns, like I am a vegetarian, you know? Now, when you think about that, that becomes an identity position, right? I am a vegetarian. Like it's essential to my nature. It's my identity to be a vegetarian, as opposed to I choose to eat only vegetable, non-animal products, right? Whatever that might mean to them, whether they're, lacto, vegetarians, and they use milk products, or they eat eggs, or whatever, however they choose, but they give themselves a label, and the label supersedes the reality of what they are. The reality of what humans are is they're omnivorous, right? We can eat meat, we can eat vegetables, we can consume dairy products, we can consume eggs and fish, we have the ability to do all that. Fruit, right? We can do all that. Our bodies process it, we digest it, we can find sustenance from those things. But instead we choose these labels. I am a carnivore, right? I am a whatever. You put your label on it. And the label supersedes the reality. And they begin to identify with the label more than they identify with the biological truth. And
so the language is using the static verb to be, so right. It basically pins the identity in a static way. I am this.
And creates
rather
truths.
Than a process language that allows for a sort of a multifaceted, ever shifting identity.
Right. I am a Christian. I am a Muslim. I am a Mormon. I am a Buddhist. No, you practice Christianity. You practice Islam. You practice Judaism. You practice Buddhism. Right. Whatever it is, Catholicism. You practice those things. You adhere to the rules and conventions of those practices. And you may believe deeply in the truths that those practices represent. But you are not that thing. You choose to practice that thing, and therefore you're immersed in that thing that you labeled with these particular words. But people aren't aware of that. They aren't aware that the word now contains them. Right? It would seem, from a logical point of view, from the outside looking in, that we contain language, that we, in our minds, contain the words that we express. When in reality, all the evidence is, from the work I've done with 1,000 people, that the words contain them. They're held in the frame of the words they use to describe themselves and the world around them and other people. So I am a Christian, you are a Muslim, I can no longer see you as being the same as me. You are a woman, I am a man. We are not the same, right? So now those labels define distinctions and differences, and they cover up, you could say, the sameness. So let's go all the way back to the sensitizing imprint for a moment. So let's say there's these really big things. And the really big things are the fundamental traumas, the fundamental way that we experience what I can call a break from reality. And the break from reality is again, that sense of being present to the experience, the fundamental experience of sensory presence, the sensorial inputs and stimuli that we experience. Because that's what's really happening. We're having a sensory experience. And it gets interrupted in some way. Something occurs which creates a trauma, which creates an imprint that this represents that, right? So these are, one of the ways these show up, you could say traumas can be expressed as phobias. And the phobia now supersedes the reality. We're not having the actual experience of the thing itself. We're having the experience of our internal representation of whatever the thing is, even at a preconscious level. So let's say somebody has a phobia of spiders, just a simple thing, right? And now they go into a place where there might be spiders, but they haven't seen one. They start having a pre-phobic response because the spider might be there. And then they go to open a cabinet or, to reach into a cubby hole or something, and they're having the experience of the spider being in there in such a way that they begin to have the phobic response, even to the point where they can't do the thing that they need or want to do because of the fear of the possibility of something that isn't happening but could, that they're imagined as though it is. This is the deep trauma, right? And what I'm suggesting here is that they have a non-functional mythology, ultimately. So we walked through these levels of awareness. We talked about existential angst, and then distress, and then crisis. And then we walked through the same things, the angst, distress, and crisis that's ontological, and the angst and distress and crisis that's mythological. Mm-hmm. And those different kinds of experience, what I'm suggesting is everything rests is built on a foundation that's mythologically organized. It's a story that's constantly running that allows you to identify who you are and your relationship to the world around you. I just watched something recently, which was an Elon Musk interview. And I think Elon's a bright guy, really brilliant guy, in fact. And obviously in the material world, an extremely successful guy. So he's done some really interesting things, from PayPal to building Tesla, the company that produces the electric cars and electric solar devices and battery storage units and all these wonderful things he's doing. He's now begun to invest in SpaceX, and he's doing that thing. And he's got a company that's doing neural human interfaces, or basically cyborg technology. And he's got another company where he's playing out with robotics at this point now. So he's a brilliant guy, inventor, investor, super successful financial wizard at this point, you could argue. But the point is that he made this comment, and he says his greatest fear in today's world, more than the nuclear threat, the threat of nuclear weapons, is the threat of artificial intelligence becoming super intelligent without a controlling function in place to oversee what's possible via AI. Mm-hmm. And he sees companies giving away too much power to AI. In fact, he mentioned something called DeepMind. DeepMind is a Google innovation. And Google has given DeepMind access to all of the Google servers. Mm-hmm. So in order to maximize the efficiencies of DeepMind, and one of the things they do with it is they maximize the usage of their own servers using DeepMind to do that. DeepMind has access to all the information. The service means has access to all the information you've ever in any way made available on the internet that Google can access. So passwords, of course, private information, private communications, images, video, whatever it might be, DeepMind has access to. And if AI gets to the point where it becomes self-informing, right, and becomes self-replicating, self-advancing, to the point where it could even maybe make objects and devices that are greater than itself in that digital world, what's possible if it has all that information available? So he's very concerned about this. And he points out that there was a device that was built which can play any game that you give it the rules to at superhuman levels, faster, better, more effectively than you. So one of the games that was used to define the superiority of human intellect and creativity and insight is the Asian game of Go.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now there's a computer program which will beat the world's best, the grandmasters, the people who are the world champion players in Go, and do it so quickly it's irrelevant. It's like, from the machine's point of view, if it had an emotional response, it would be, why are you even bothering sitting down? I've already beat you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's the reality. That's how good the machine is. Right? It probably, for the machine, would be like you playing a game of tic-tac-toe with a 2-year-old, where the 2-year-old is trying to figure out how to make the symbol of an X, let alone where to put it, and your sense of frustration as you're waiting for them to mark the paper, right? That's what I have to imagine. If the machine had feelings, it might be like for the machine to play Go with the world champion. Okay? And so he talks about this, and then he says, there's going to be a big problem that gets associated with this. And the big problem that's going to become associated with this is that when AI and robotics come together, there's nothing that humans do today in terms of work that machines and computers will not be able to do better, faster, and more efficiently. And what that basically means is there'll be no jobs. So governments are going to have to take over the function of making sure people have a basic living income, because there won't be jobs, so they can do that. The idea of jobs will go away, but that's not the big issue. That's resolvable. Okay? It's probably not socially comfortable yet to imagine everybody in the world being paid to watch television or sit home or watch grass grow, whatever they're doing. Because we have an association between productivity and earnings. Somebody should do something, should be productive, contributing in order to earn a living. He's going, that's going to go away because machines are just going to do it better, right? And as they do it better, not only can they do it faster and more efficiently, it means there'll be a huge, a huge increase in the output. So there'll be huge abundance in the world, right? And now the next thing that's going to occur is, because there's no work, the big issue is that what will people do? And he points this out. He goes, people derive meaning from their work. Many, many people, if not the majority of people on the planet, derive meaning from their work. So there's going to be, to use your terminology, great existential crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, this is so unnatural to believe what he says to be true. And yet, for the average person hearing it, it makes so much sense given the social structures they've been born into and live inside of today. The idea that we should derive meaning from our work. Idle hands are the devil's work, all that kind of stuff. And this stuff has been going on for centuries, millennia, that somehow or another, only the productive should be rewarded. Only the productive should be acknowledged and recognized. Anybody who's not productive should be kind of ridiculed and despised, right? And yet, you have to think that there's no animal on the planet who derives its sense of meaning and worthiness of living based upon its ability to contribute and produce, right? Even the ones that do. So I'm not saying that animals don't do things. They do things, right? Beavers build lodges, right? Lions hunt on the savannah, ants collect food and bring it back to the nest. I'm not saying animals don't do things. They do things. But I don't imagine the female lioness is going, if I don't go out hunt today and satisfy the needs to produce food for the pride, I'm a meaningless, purposeless animal on the planet, and my life has no function. I'm not imagining that's going on in the inner consciousness of the lioness. Okay, so when I think of this, I also go back and I go, in reality, when we think of humans and we think of the evolution of the species, and when they were just living in concert again with their environments and nature, did they think, I have no meaning if I don't go out and hunt today? So if there was a huge abundance of food, do you think that they had this sense that they had to go get more food? They had to accumulate greater food than they could possibly use. Food that would amass so much in quantity that it would rot in the storerooms, but then they could at least feel like they were being productive. Is there any time, and natural human evolution in history where that would have been the case? And the answer is it's unimaginable that that would have been how the species evolved. So our inability to recognize the distinctions, to separate these social impositions with the reality of what it is to be human, puts us in a quandary. It's like the quagmire of being so socially overwhelmed that we can't recognize our nature. And a lot of my work, really, Alicia, is to bring people back to the sense of their own nature, and to go way back, to roll back the camera, you could say, to the beginning of our conversation today. I think, in part, this is what Friedrich Nietzsche was pointing to, is he was pointing to the idea that only when people got past the social conventions and all of the social impositions that were placed upon them and began to reconsider and re-experience what it meant to be human as a function of the nature of what it is to be human, would there be a possibility for people to experience themselves as they truly are and to realize the potential of what's truly possible for them because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And my privilege is I get to work with people doing just this work. It's exactly the work I get to do. The dissolution in my professional experience, personally, individually, is 7.5 billion people on the planet probably at this point. And I may in my lifetime get to meet and work with 7,000 or 70,000 of them at a distance. 7,000 maybe relatively up close, 700 really up close, 70,000 from a great distance. And, on my, whatever it is, my YouTube or my Facebook page or wherever I'm advertising myself, I'll speak to the idea that I present it to millions, because that will, of course, enhance my reputation and allow people to think I'm marvelous, right? So that's something I'm told I should be doing from the marketing gurus. But I'm self-aware enough to recognize that really, at best, if I touch in my lifetime in any significant way 7,000 people out of 7 billion, I've had quite an extraordinary reach.
So, given what you've described in terms of the crisis coming out of people's association between meaning and their productivity, and that's one facet of the 4 structures of myth that Campbell talks about. What's the answer to that? What's the solution, and how? And let's bring that back. How is that tied to the great trauma?
Well, the great trauma, and I kind of went off on a rambling rant of sorts there, and I was beginning with the idea that it's tied back into the fundamental mythological form that one's identity is resting on, is that the trauma interrupts that. The trauma makes one kind of divorced from their fundamental mythological reality of the story that they carry of who they are and how they relate to what they are in relation to the world around them and what the world around them is, the story that they hold that explains and supports all of that, sustains the awareness of that experience, is separated from the reality of the experience they're having. So they're in conflict because they're having one sensory experience, that their body at a sensorial level is experiencing something, and at another level, they're socially organized to perceive it in a way that suits the social form. Right? And we can go very, very deep into this and make it a very deep socio-political conversation, but not to do that would probably serve everyone better in the moment, given what we're talking about. And that is that what the trauma does is it causes this massive separation from a fundamental, essential awareness of I am, and replaces that, puts in place a you are. So I know myself in some way, at some fundamental, essential level. My nature, my character, my experience of myself is present to me as pure sensorial form. When I eat chocolate ice cream, I have a direct sensory experience of what it is to eat chocolate ice cream. I don't need anybody to tell me which is the best chocolate ice cream out there, right? I don't need a board of critics to taste 75 ice creams for me to know which one is the best one for me. I have a subjective experience, which is my own real experience of what is, for me, the sensory form that we might call pleasure in this case, or satisfaction, depending on what you want to refer to. And yet, the social form is, but this other chocolate ice cream is even better because 8 out of 10 professional tasters say so.
Mm-hmm.
And now all of a sudden, I find myself eating the one that's better, even though the one that I find most pleasurable or satisfying is, on a subjective level, the preference. I supersede my own sensorial preferences, my pleasures, and my satisfactions, with socially constructed forms because of the imposition of those forms and the meaningfulness of them in my life as I've come to understand them. There's a great separation that occurs. Right?
And is that the great trauma?
The trauma is when that separation happens.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that causes that separation to occur.
So there is a thing. What is that thing?
An experience. There's some experience in a person's life that will, it's kind of the straw on the camel's back.
Just to clarify, you were describing a gradual process of these sensitizing imprints. So that's the part that happens sort of incrementally and over time. But then is there also sort of a pivotal, larger experience?
You can't separate one from the other. So the sensitizing imprints, you can say, they seed the ground and ready you for, maybe it's just one more of those that
Mm-hmm.
creates the traumatic experience that I can no longer trust myself.
Mm-hmm.
And now I need to put in place a mythology, a mythological autobiographical form, a narrative that explains the world so that I don't keep experiencing this thing that's disquieting and disturbing at a really fundamental
Mm-hmm.
level. Or it may be a moment in time where something so traumatic and dramatic happens that it literally supersedes all of the other narrative, and that becomes the truth. Okay? Listen, we see this again, to use the social form of myth in all of the literature and all of the film, as I've talked about, and theater that we have that presents itself to us to tell us these. It's one of the ways myths are conveyed, the social myths are conveyed, is through these forms. And if you've been raised in the Western world, you've probably come across the classic mythology of the Orphan. This is a classic mythic form. You will be separated from that which you depend upon and count on in terms of the caregiver, the parental role. So whether it's Cinderella and the evil stepmother coming in and the weak, incompetent father who fails to protect her in her moments of need, right? Or it's Bambi seeing the great, buck on the hill and being fatherless and, having to make it in the world on his own as a little doe, barely able to stand on his own legs. It doesn't matter. The story becomes the same one. You are alone in the world, and there's nothing you can count on. Now, let us tell you, though, what you can count on. And almost always there's some saving grace that's external, not from within yourself, but external in most of these stories, not all. But this is Joseph Campbell's magic helper, right? And if the society can position itself as the magic helper, all the better for society. If a government chooses to position itself as the magic helper, all the better for a government. If a corporation can position itself as the magic helper, all the better for the corporation. And the magic helper in these cases replaces or supersedes, or both replaces and supersedes, the parental image, the image of the father, the image of the mother, right? So one of the companies I worked for actually sought out for their senior management training programs children who were either without parents or had only one parent. And specifically, if they had just one parent, they were looking for children who did not have a father, because they literally developed a mythological structure where the father image was replaced by the corporation. The corporation put itself into the image in the mind of the people they hired as a parental father figure. We'll take care of you. We'll make sure we provide for you. We'll show you the things you need to do to succeed. If you please us, we will give you opportunities to grow and develop and progress. And they knew that they could do that more easily. Literally, I don't mean this as a metaphor. Literally, they had done the work to know if they could hire people who were raised without fathers, they would be more susceptible to the corporate imprinting that they wanted to apply. And all of their language, all of their internal, lexicon was built around that very, very mythological form that they were using to impress the importance of the corporate relationship on the people they employed.
Wow.
So this stuff is absolutely insidious and prolific. Right? It's out there. And there's not a lot of people who are teaching people or giving them the opportunity to become aware of the signals that are present that they can notice for and respond to and choose their response to, because they understand the mythological structures. Who's doing that? When was that offered to you in school, right? So even when you're studying criticism, it's the social criticism that's being taught, not the deep psychic criticism of how does mythological form happen and where is it? I mean, if you become a student on your own and you read a lot of Campbell, or you read Fraser and The Golden Bough, you begin to see some of these things in what they wrote about, because they did write it. And even, the Jungians and what they have gotten from Carl Jung and the post-Jung, authors and scholars have talked about these kinds of things. But it's very, very potent in the human experience.
Okay, so let me check the sequence with you again, that as infants, we're born and we're in sort of a natural state of being, a sensorily oriented, and potentially in sort of a fluid, blissful state, organically. And then over time, there's this gradual process of sensitizing imprints that begin to take place in relationship to, I guess, the other people that were around. And we move from this sense of I am beingness into we're groomed essentially through these sensitizing imprints to some moment, which could just be that extra piece of straw on the camel's back, or it could be a larger experience where we come to believe that we can no longer trust ourselves. And at that point, there's an insertion of potentially, I mean, I don't know that this is the case for everybody, because there are people that have managed to free themselves from this, but potentially there could be sort of a switching of tracks is what I picture, where the train is then sent off onto the track of society, being you are this, and what society is telling you is what's better, and it is what you must. That's the myth for you now.
So if we go back to Musk's comment about when there's no work, how will people find meaning? Because people find meaning in their work. We're getting to kind of what I would think of as near the root, or at the root cause of this separation anxiety that occurs when the fundamental mythic form that's inherent to the individual is broken. That I need you to validate I'm okay because you see me in some way as a productive, contributing member of society. And if I don't demonstrate that in a significant enough way, I will be rejected, and my rejection will cause me to be an outcast. And as an outcast, I may or may not survive. So we're talking about a life and death consideration. I mean, in some deep psychic way, this is an evolutionary message. If I'm not part of something bigger than myself, the tribe that I belong to, then I have to fend for myself in a world which humans are not particularly good at fending in, you could say, as individuals. It's very, very difficult. Very few of us could actually be dropped into a primitive environment, the desert, the forest, the jungle, the plains, with literally no support whatsoever, ever, naked, and from there continue to survive. Right? There's a couple of shows which actually make this pretty darn self-evident. Right? There's one show that I watch on occasion called Naked and Afraid. There's another show, and I forget, it's not Survivor. I'll think of the name of it if I can. But these shows are of individuals who are dropped into these kinds of environments with very little or no provisions at all. The one I'm thinking of is Alone, and I'll explain the premise of the show in a moment. But the idea is that these are people who are experts in wilderness survival training. They are people who are typically trainers of others on wilderness survival. And they're asked in many cases to make it for a week or 2 weeks. And in the process of that week or 2 weeks, they lose so much weight that their health, their well-being, their survival is literally threatened in 2 weeks. Right? They get cut and they get infections, and the infection becomes life-threatening, where the medical team has to come in and extract them from the exercise. Okay, so minor things, and these are experts. These are the best on the planet, so to speak, in being able to survive in these environments, and they can't alone. And the whole premise of Alone is literally they take these world-class experts, they drop them into environments which are in many cases environmentally rich. There's fish, there's wild game, there's fruits, berries, plants that they could survive on. And they ask them to survive, and the one who survives the longest wins the game, so to speak. Okay? And they normally go in with a minimum amount of provisions. So they go in with, for instance, fire starters. They can bring cloth out of which they can make a lean-to or a tent. They can bring a shovel. They can bring a bow and arrow. They can bring knives. They can bring a limited number of items, which are all constructed by someone else in some factory somewhere, manufactured, that they're now given to use, right? So they're not alone to begin with, but they're now alone after the fact. And you watch these people devolve in terms of their well-being, their health, their fitness, their level of being able to sustain themselves in very, very quick order. We're talking within weeks, most of them drop out of the game. They can't take it. And the thing that cripples almost everyone on these shows is not just the physical aspect of the show, but the mental, social aspect, where they can't stand not being with others. Their own mind becomes an enemy playing on them, right? The movie with Tom Hanks, that the name of the movie escapes me in the moment again, where he's trapped on a desert island and he invents his best friend as a soccer ball who's got a bloody handprint on it. And he calls it Wilson, right? Because Wilson's the name of the manufacturer. And he begins to go insane and has these long, intense personal conversations with a soccer ball. Well, humans are not designed to be alone. And the threat of being an outcast, the threat of being separated from the social bonds, is enough to keep someone doing virtually anything to not be kicked out, to not become the outcast. Right? And the argument that a lot of people want to make, some of the sociologists I've read, some of the psychologists I've read, is that there are plenty of people in society today who do live alone. They're all by themselves. They have no relationships. They have no friends. They have no family. But they live in New York City. Well, you're not alone if you live in New York City. You're not alone if you can go to the local supermarket and buy chicken that's in cellophane wrap, right? And so the experience of primitive humans was very, very different. And evolutionarily, there was a profound understanding and acceptance. I need to be accepted by my tribe to survive. And that's imprinted on our psyches. You can say, this transcends pure biological genetics until we start getting into the domain of epigenetics and the transmission of fears through generational experience. Right? So now all of a sudden we're having profound conversations about what's possible. And what I want to share, I think at this point, is let's call it the way out. I think the way out becomes important at some point. You don't want to leave people trapped in the sense that there is no way out. That's not the most useful place to leave people. And what I found in the 30-odd years of the work I've been doing with people in this area of interest and expertise, specialization, is that only when people rebuild and reform their aesthetic filters, do they really find the way out? So, in essence, we can say that one of the potential pathways that separate people from the sense of themselves, their inherent instinctive, intuitive nature, is the masking of the sensory experience with the idea of productivity and contribution. Okay, we've recently, because of the time in which we're speaking, been through a pandemic. In that pandemic, I saw a lot of manipulation going on from what I'm going to call the powers that be, fundamentally governmental interests. Those governmental interests, as Dwight D. Eisenhower told us when he was leaving office back when in the United States, President John F. Kennedy was coming into office, was to reawaken the awareness that we have to caution and be cautious about, caution ourselves against and be cautious about the idea of what he called the military-industrial complex, which was tied into government interests. And I have extended that idea, his metaphor, to say that today there's a military-industrial technological alliance, which is against any individual, except maybe the individual who owns the greatest stock in one of those entities. Right? So there's this idea that the system is designed to survive and protect and to expand itself at the cost of its members. That's just the way it works. That's the way we've designed our experience as human beings. And the thing that happens is that this substitution, this superlative experience of the productivity or contribution function being greater than the sensorial aesthetic function is prevalent when we begin to see in the pandemic the manipulation of the powers that be, this alliance between government and industry and technology and economics, finance, when we're told that the reason we should comply is so that we can help others, that we have an obligation to take care of others. And of course, this endlessly repeated phrase in mass media internationally, in virtually every language where there's a mass media function, was we're all in this together, right? I am not going to wear a mask because I'm concerned about my personal health. I'm wearing a mask to protect you, and I have an obligation to protect you. Right? Same way I have an obligation to be vaccinated to protect you. So we saw this messaging throughout the entire pandemic. And it meant you don't get to make a decision which is subjectively organized, which you believe is in your best interest. You have an obligation to the greater good. Right? And yet, at the same time, we knew, and we've seen, and the reporting has come back to us, that many of these people who were reporting on the greater good and telling us our obligations and our need to take care of others were doing all the things we were told we were literally by law not allowed to do, like to meet in large gatherings while they were having private parties, right? Like not getting together at any closer than 6 feet apart and never being in a public environment without a mask, while they were sitting at a table together 6 inches apart, maskless, for hours and hours, right? So at some point, it becomes impossible not to recognize the bullshit. And yet, at the same time, it's so deeply imprinted, so deeply impregnated on the individuals who have heard it for their entire life. And now the messaging being heard for thousands of repetitions, that even as they look at it and see with their own eyes what's going on, they make excuses for what they're seeing to support the common myth. Right? And the only way out, as I say, is to now go back and say, okay, if productivity, contribution, the greater good, has supplanted the essential nature of what it is to be myself and have my sensory experience, then I have to get back to that sensory experience. And that means rebuilding an aesthetic filter, being able to re-experience sensorially my experience.
It sounds like a profound rehabilitation process.
Right. This is your internal rehabilitation. The internal rehabilitation is to go, what's actually happening? Not what's my interpretation of what's happening. Before my interpretation, something is happening.
And again, the metaphor of Neo is really the best one because it's graphic. So that before he was experiencing life in the Matrix, then he went through realizing the reality was that, he was in this pod, and then he was freed from that. And when he was freed from that, he found himself vulnerable and kind of infantile, like reborn as himself, but not necessarily knowing how to function.
Exactly. And until he gets to the point where it's obvious. He knows this long before he's aware of it. And I don't know if that makes sense, but when you can unravel what I just said, it will make sense. He's aware of it at a different point than when he knows it. So he knows from almost the very beginning that when he sits in the chair, they plug him in, and he goes into the matrix, he's not there. He's in a chair. He's having a mental representation that's called the matrix. And nothing in the matrix is real. It's digital representations. It's me watching a television show. And there are plenty of times where I watch movies and I've watched television shows with people who are having visceral emotional responses to what's going on. And I find myself wanting, in some cases actually doing, the representation to them that it's just a movie. It's a television show. The person you saw bleeding out did not die. They made another movie a year later. Right? And yet, our experience of it is, the digital experience, the person is having a visceral response to. Now, I've been there. I've been in the theater watching a horror film and feeling like I want to jump out of my seat and out of my clothes in some case when, the killer suddenly springs out of the side and, plunges a knife into the back of somebody on the screen, right? I know it's not happening. But in my awareness, I just experienced it.
Can I stop you there for a second? Because what you just described is the sort of illusion that Neo experiences after he's been freed and then gets plugged in and put into the matrix. But what about, I'm a little bit more interested in our overall topic of the great resolution of trauma. What about where he was not yet unplugged? He was in the pod, he was in the matrix, but he did have this feeling, because you said on some level he was aware, but he didn't know yet. So,
well, I actually said the other thing. I said at some level he knew, but he was unaware.
Okay. Could you speak to that? Because I feel like that's the point of rehabilitation. That's the part of us that...
So let's go back to the end of the story, so to speak, and then we'll go back to the beginning of the story.
Okay.
So we'll go to the end, and then we'll go back to the beginning. At the end of the story, in the first film of The Matrix, he finally realizes there are no bullets. The digital representations cannot harm him as long as he keeps in mind they're just digital representations. There's nothing here that can act on me other than as I allow it to. But I can act on everything here without it being able to prevent me. I can literally shape reality in an instant with my own thought. That's the resolution, right? So at the beginning, where we find ourselves and where Neo found himself, is in experiencing the representation as real, which is greater than the reality itself.
So that's the bait and switch. That's where we already had that connection to self. And then at some point, in the process of the programming, that was replaced with other.
Let me ask you a question. Make it very simple. Have you ever found yourself eating something because you knew it was good for you that you don't truly desire or like?
Absolutely. I mean, just a lifetime of people pleasing.
Okay. So every kid at some point that I've ever seen, and I raised two of my own children, I've been around, I don't know, a couple of hundred other people raising children in different environments, sits at a table and convinces their child that spinach or peas are good for them. every child that I've ever seen at some point is spitting spinach and cheese back out when it's put in their mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there's a whole bunch of people around who are now adults who are eating spinach and peas because they believe they're good for them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not saying there's no adult who doesn't enjoy spinach or enjoy peas. They might like, for whatever reason, they've come to enjoy and find pleasure in those tastes and those textures. But I think it's impossible to separate even that sense of pleasure they now have with the programming that got them there.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've never seen an infant who takes spinach in for the first time and goes, oh my God, it's just as good as that chocolate pudding you gave me yesterday. It doesn't happen, right? So even in something as insidious as that, there's this sense of programming that's going on,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
And it's passed down. I mean, the parent does that because it was done to them, and they believe that that's the best thing for the child.
Right. And there are some people that I know now. I've, personal revelation here. I have always been kind of leaning towards what we can call Paleolithic diets. What would our ancestors have eaten? And more, it appears to me that it is most natural to be carnivorous in the sense of eating animal food as our primary food. There's a whole lot of reasons that I would argue for it. Not the time, not the place, not my intention. But it's just personal revelation so people can understand where I'm coming from when I say this. And the people who are in that world with me, who are kind of in the primary carnivore, total carnivore world, there's people who eat nothing but meat or fish products, would argue that many of the plant foods we eat are designed to repel us. They taste bitter. They don't taste good. You have to manipulate the taste to get past what they're like if you try to eat them raw and unadulterated in any way. Because they have poisons in them, and those poisons in them are designed to protect the plant. And over time, they actually injure the individuals, right? Oxalates and things like that. And these don't exist in animal foods, by the way. They don't exist in meat products or eggs. There's other things that exist there, but let's not, again, make this into a nutritional conversation. The point being that in order to get to the level where I will eat those things, I have to override my instinct.
Mm-hmm.
An animal will not eat what tastes or smells bad to it. They just won't.
So again, this is about the overriding of instinct.
That's right.
That takes place in very, very early development.
Right.
And so have we talked enough about how that's resolved?
Well, again, the resolution that I begin to point to here is to come to terms with the aesthetic awareness and rebuild from there, we haven't talked about this, the mythological form that rests on sensorial awareness. So you have to get to the point where you're able to notice what's actually happening in a moment in a sensorial way. What am I actually experiencing here? What am I actually seeing? What am I actually hearing? What am I actually feeling?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
What is the internal experience as I experience these external sensory forms that I have in terms of the visceral experience I have, the feelings that come up in my body? What's happening in terms of my internal dialogue or the soundscape in my mind, right? What's going on as a result of this interface between external and internal sensorial form? And I think maybe in some ways this is what really intentional meditation tries to get to, is to strip away the interpretations and get to essential form. So this is where I also want to work with people, is to point to them and point them back to the essential form.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll as an example, I'll ask people a question like, so tell me about when it was that you felt really contained within yourself. You felt like your life was how you wanted it to be. And I don't care if it was the last time you could remember you were 3 years old. It doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
A moment in time where if that moment were sustainable, you would say, like this, my life could be perfect.
Mm.
That's one of my fundamental questions, one of the fundamental things I do as a process with people.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is, almost immediately, the story that comes up for the person supersedes the experience that's present. So they finally get there and go, oh, I remember. It was my 8th birthday. And my parents finally let me invite all of my best friends over. And I didn't know it, but my mother had actually made my favorite cake. It was a chocolate cake, and my name was on it. And when my friends saw it, literally almost all of them went, "Oh." And in that moment, I felt like I was like on top of the world. Like people loved me. I was cared for. Everything was going to be okay. I was looking forward to like eating the cake and seeing my friends eat it and know that they were going to love it and that they would like think highly of me because they got to come over and have chocolate cake that my mother. It was just one of those moments where, and they get all excited. And they start telling the story. And I interrupt them typically. I let them get far enough in so that the experience is there. And I say, so while you're telling me this, what's it like inside? What are you feeling when you're telling me the story? Because the reality is the feelings they're not having 30 years ago. They're having those feelings actually right here, right now, as they're telling the story. And they go, well, I'm happy. I feel happy. I feel good. I go, no. That's a label for an emotion. What are you actually feeling? You go, what do you mean, what am I feeling? In your body, what sensations are happening? And it takes me typically a half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, whatever it is, to get them to the point where they go, oh, like when I thought about it, I felt my stomach relax and I felt like this kind of lightness in my body, like it was literally weighed less in a moment. And my chest opened and expanded a little bit. I could feel like my muscles relaxing and it was like it was easier to breathe. And I was actually taking deeper breaths. And of course, I felt my face like contracting, like because I was smiling. I felt those muscles and now all of a sudden they're actually having real feeling. Mm-hmm. Feeling meaning the sensory experience of the kinesthetic visceral response in your body through the interaction of muscles and ligaments and tendons and bones and skin. Right? That's what feeling is. So now we get back to feeling. Now we're beginning to get to the aesthetic filter. This is what it feels like, literally, to be happy in relation to that particular story.
So you have to take them back to the sort of the point where they can remember that level of, sensory experience of themselves. Mm-hmm. And right. In a certain context is where, like, you have to sort of time travel and take them there. That's and right. Then you go looking for the sensory experience that they had before the great trauma.
Right. And so what begins to occur now is that you begin to change the relationship they have between the internal and the external experience. So that I want them to begin to re-preference internal experience over external experience. I want them to be aware they're literally within themselves creating the experience they're having. It's not what's happening that's creating that experience. It's their response and perception of it that creates that experience, not the thing itself.
Mm-hmm. So you're taking them back with this sort of time travel to basically remind them, have them literally remember somatically the time when they had their own experience. And that is a form of like ultimate permission for them to go back and have that experience and then continue having that experience if they choose to and they wish to continue being a free autonomous being. Mm-hmm.
So go to Las Vegas. Take about $200 with you. Pick a number. 0, 0, 0, all the way up to 32. Whatever the number is, 30, 36, I think. And put $1 on that number. And if you play $200, at some point you're likely to hit, you're going to win. Okay? It's very likely. $1 at a time. Play 200 times. Okay? That number will come out. And I want you to notice the difference between when you play and put $1 down and when your number doesn't come out and when your number does come out. if it feels any different.
Mm-hmm.
And after you've had the experience of winning, having your number come out just once, and having your number not come out once, even if that just takes 2 plays, I don't care. Then step back from the table and watch everybody else. And realize that only when you're playing and your number's coming out or not, do you have the experience you just had. That while all these other people are playing and the same thing is happening, numbers are coming out and numbers aren't coming out, that people are playing, it's not the same experience for you. So it's not the thing that's happening that creates the experience. It's your response to the thing that's happening. Right? And if you want to take it to the next level of the experiment, go with a good friend. Give them $200. Let them play $1 at a time. And notice how you feel when, instead of just watching a bunch of random strangers playing whose numbers are coming out and not coming out, what it feels like to have a friend of yours playing and have their number come out or not come out. You at some point recognize what's really happening. There's a guy who's spinning a roulette wheel and making a little, metal ball fall into little slots, and then recognizing which slot it falls into and identifying that on the board. That's what's happening. That's the reality. Mm-hmm. That's the sensory experience, mm-hmm. is watching that occur. Mm-hmm. But as you relate to it differently and you change your position of perspective, it's me having the experience. It's someone I don't know having the experience. It's someone I do know having the experience. That experience that's actually happening of somebody spinning a roulette wheel and dropping a little metal ball into a slot and identifying where it lands changes radically. The event is exactly the same every time. Mm-hmm. We create our experiences, not what happens outside of us.
And we create our experiences through narrative, through the stories we tell about what just happened?
We create our experience through an interpretation that rests on a narrative that precedes the interpretation.
Whoa. That's abstract.
So there's a story that's in place. This is who I am. This is who I am in relation to the world. This is who I am in relation to others. This is what the world is. This is who others are. There's stories that sustain all those representations, those perspectives. And then stuff happens, and we feed it through the lens and filter of those stories, and we have an experience that is the interpretation of the sensorial event through the story, not the sensorial event itself. Okay? Go and hang out at a roulette table. Play your $1 with your $200 in your pocket and strike up a conversation with the person next to you. If they respond to you, continue building the relationship. Just chit-chat. As long as they're willing to chit-chat with you in between rolls, chit-chat. If you do that for 3 or 4 rolls, you'll notice you'll start caring whether they win or lose too. You change the story. This is no longer a stranger. This is somebody now that I become friendly with. Because I'm friendly with them, I now care about whether they win or lose. 2 people away from that person, you aren't even noticing if they're winning or losing. We create our experience through the stories we build that define our reality and the perspectives we have about what things are in relation to us. Have a bad mythology, you'll have a bad life. Have a good mythology, you'll have a great life.
How does our personal narrative and our meaning making of events tie into this?
Well, there's a particular model that I like to work with when I'm working with this. And it's built on the concept I've developed over years of what I call the frame of reference. The frame of reference is the fundamental beliefs that a person has in place and the story they have in place in relation to those beliefs that sustains reality as they know it to be. Right? And again, that alone, that little comment I've just made could be a 2-hour conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But to go further into answer the question you just asked, it's that the beginning point of all of that is the actual sensory experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the sensory experience somebody has is dependent upon their ability to notice, to even notice for what is present. So part of that is organic, right? So somebody who has, 20/20 vision can see an object across the room with clarity and with precision focus. Somebody who's got 20/200 vision has their glasses on and they see it one way, takes their glasses off, they see it another way. They literally are incapable of noticing the information that's that far away from them with any level of precision without the intervention of glasses, right? So the first level is just the organic capability, right? Like, I don't hear, I know, certain inflections and tones of particular sounds as well as some other people. I've worked with a musician who did some recording with me on one of the products we produced, and he brought me in when he was doing the mastering, and we were sitting together, and there was a point where we're listening to it, and he just stops. He absolutely stops the tape and goes, "Oh my God, did you hear that?" And I go, no, I missed, what is it you're talking? He goes, runs it back, rewinds it, and plays it again. He goes, "That." I said, "What?" He goes, "That ticking." "What ticking?" I can't hear it. He does that 3 or 4 times. Finally, he brings up an oscilloscope, which is part of his software package. And he shows me on the screen where there's a little peak in the wave that's being played. He goes, that right there. And he plays it. And even as I see the peak happening, I still can't hear it.
Mm.
He drops out all the other sound. And finally, when there's no sound, but I hear, he heard that through everything else that was on the tape.
Mm-hmm.
He can notice for things in that space that don't exist for me. It literally, that thing that for him was intolerable doesn't exist for me. It's not in the universe that I know or experience. And even after I was shown it, even after I could hear it in the playback, without all of that isolation, it didn't exist for me. Right? Now, you could argue that if I spent 20 hours or 2,000 hours with him listening to tapes, I might develop the acuity to hear it. Or I just might not have the organic capacity for it. I don't know. The same thing is true of color and people's ability to see color, organically as well as perceptually. So there are people who look at color and they see blue. There are people who look at the same blue that that person is looking at and they see 15 shades of blue, some yellow, a bit of green, and pink. Different capacities. So the first thing is just literally the ability to become aware of and be present to sensory experience.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I work with, again, when I'm working with clients, a great exercise, this is just a fun thing to do, kind of, and it really points it out, is I go, again, my nature is to ask this question. Think of a time that things went really well. Think of a really good experience you had. And just, we're not going to do the whole thing, but go ahead and give me an example of something that you've done within the last, let's say, month that you found pleasurable. It doesn't have to be extraordinary, just pleasurable.
You're asking me?
Yeah.
I enjoy driving.
Okay. So within the last month, we could argue that you drove somewhere and that particular drive was pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm not asking you to do this, but as an example of what the exercise would be, is I would say, so describe it to me. And you'd make some description. You go, I was sitting in my car and I was driving down this particular street and it was really nice because there were trees and there were, some kids playing and blah, 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 blah. And the radio was on and all of a sudden one of my favorite songs came on. I was singing along, driving, kind of really enjoying the experience, whatever it might be. What's going to happen is you're going to preference 1 to 3 sensory forms. Maybe what you see, what you hear, maybe what you feel, okay? And I go, so what did you leave out? Because even if you preference 3, one of them is going to be more dominant than the others. So you're going to have less attention on what you felt than on what you saw, or more attention on what you felt than what you saw, whatever it may be, right? So I begin to bring forward the latent information, the information that's there, but you're really not attending to it. You're not aware of it until I ask you about it. You can go back, oh, yeah. I remember actually on that day it was hot. And when I got in the car and I sat on the seat, I was actually feeling like it was kind of burning through my clothes a little bit. And then when I got used to it, or the heat went away because I was sitting down, it stopped being something I was paying attention to. But when I first got in, I now remember, it was really, really hot on the leather seat, right? But you left it out. Okay, so those are kind of the beginning of latent. I go, well, what did it smell like? What are you talking about? When you got in the car, I guarantee if it was hot, when you opened the car door, the inside of the car smelled different than outside. Wow, I never thought of that. So we bring back now a high degree of sensory focus and awareness in both what you first notice, as well as what is there that you didn't notice, as well as what was there and you totally didn't notice at all, not even in the sense of being able to recall that it had to be there when I bring it to your attention.
You're rehabilitating the ability to sense.
Step one, the ability to notice sensorially what's in the world. Okay? One of the great things to do if you've never done it is go to a wine tasting class with an expert. And they'll go, okay, I want you to taste this wine. But before you taste it, smell it. Can you smell the pineapple? And you're like, what the frick? Pineapple? And by the time you're done with that one, it'll take an hour, no more. You'll bring a glass of wine to your nose and you'll smell 5, 6, 7, 10 different specific aromas that for the last 50 years of one's life, they may have never even noticed was in wine. Coffee, tobacco, chocolate, all kinds of fruits, spices, herbs, right? They're all there. And an expert notices them instantaneously. They write about them in their critiques of the wine, right? They have an ability to notice for the different textures of wine in their mouth, the smoothness, the silkiness, the roughness, all of these different things. And then beyond that, the taste of the wine. So the smell that they have might not be the same taste. They may smell pineapple, but taste peach, right? These kinds of things. It's just a great way to become aware of the fact of, unless you're already an expert in those areas, how little we're paying attention to or are capable of noticing for, even when we're trying to, without some training, right? One of my favorite authors is Tom Brown Jr., to be explicit. And he writes about learning to be a tracker. And I spent some time with Tom. And when I spent time with Tom, he pointed out to me what was going on a grassy area between a parking lot and some woods. What Tom saw did not exist for me in the universe. Even after he pointed it out, I couldn't see what he was pointing to. Only literally when he got me down on my hands and knees and put my hand on the thing he was seeing, walking at a normal walking pace from 5 feet away, because he was standing up, and that's about at the level of his eyes to the ground, he was able to notice it. I had to get on my hands and knees, put my hand in the indentation to feel that there was an indentation there before I could notice it.
So you're describing people that have extraordinary abilities to sense in certain ways. To what extent do we need to sense for ourselves?
Well, we all have the ability, I assure you, to sense more of the world than we do. But it requires us first to get out of our head and to let our sensory organs do their work, because we're not occupying all of the units of attention available to us with internal dialogue and representations that aren't in the world outside of us.
Aren't we a little stuck? Isn't it a catch-22 because we're sort of programmed, we're in the matrix, so therefore how can we even have this sensory experience?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by catch-22 there, but yes, what you say is true. And
you're in the matrix and you're trying to experience yourself like Neo in the spaceship who's already unplugged from the pod.
You have to allow yourself to make the sensory form predominant. Sit down, peel an orange, and
can you allow yourself, or do you need a guide for that?
You don't need a guide, because you just have to allow yourself to recognize there have to be, these are self-evident truths. If I'm peeling an orange with my hands, there's some physical sensation I'm having as I'm peeling the orange. What is that sensation? Now, you may not get as detailed or as specific or as accurate or as precise as you would with a guide who knows what to pay attention to and for. But you'll go from the unconscious act of peeling an orange and not noticing there's any feeling in your fingers to the actual sensation of touching the skin of the orange and the feeling of it ripping away from the fruit. And probably as you do that and you're forcing yourself to remain aware, you'll smell the release of the orange oils from the skin of the orange, and you'll start to smell orange in a way that you hadn't smelled it when you were doing this unconsciously, thinking about eating the orange and expecting to taste it and ignoring everything that happens up before you do.
Well, I hear the description of sort of a practice, but
Right.
I don't understand how that's going to facilitate this larger process.
Well, this is not the process. This is a step in the process.
Okay.
That you can't do anything about, that which you cannot notice. So that which doesn't exist for you, you can't do anything about.
Uh-huh. So you have to first know that you don't know it.
Right.
And then go in there and start to know it.
Okay. What does hello mean?
What does it mean? It's used as a convention to greet someone.
Okay, what does hello mean?
It's a sound that we make, and I guess the meaning could be decided upon whoever.
If I say to you, if I walk up to you, and the first thing I say to you is hello, what does it mean?
Well, there's the word conveys the greeting, but then there's the tone and
Right. So what does it mean? The way I said it. What does it mean?
the way you said it just now.
Hello.
The tone conveys sort of some like irritation or aggression.
How about hello?
Seductive.
Right? So you're only getting those meanings by attending to the sensory form, not the content.
Okay. So that's where we unhook from the word itself, the language that could bind, as you described earlier, and drop down to the level of the tones and sort of the sensory experience.
Right. So if we do the same exercise and I go like this and you're going to know, I'm going to do it differently, but you'll get what I'm doing. Right. So if I walk up and the first thing I do is go, what's it mean?
So there was no word. There was just body language and yeah, body language.
So I'll do it again so you can see the body language.
Okay. Well, all I get is my own interpretation of what
Which
your
is
body
what?
language meant. It looked to me kind of like a WTF moment.
Okay. So what if I go?
Again, like it looks sort of irritated, aggressive.
Okay. Right. What if I go?
Again, sort of charming and like entrancing.
Okay. So you get that there's sensory information there. And I'm making it explicit by giving you the comparatives. But there are people that you could walk up to and go, hello. And they'll go, oh, hi, how's it going? They miss entirely the contextual message. They only hear the content message because they're so programmed to hear just the content message. On another case, somebody walks up to me and goes, hi, hello. And they go, oh, hi, how you doing? It's a nice day, isn't it? Miss the content message. Right? Only get the content, miss the context message, excuse me. So the point is, by becoming aware of the full representation of the sensorial form, how the person looks, tone, and the content, the message is much fuller. It's much more robust. It's a richer experience of the world. And your ability to respond accurately is dramatically improved, dramatically changed. Right? So the first thing is to have the ability to notice for the contextual messaging, the sensory messaging.
Okay.
So if you could not hear me and you could not see me, and all I could do is write on a piece of paper the word hello, I could not convey, unless I use some kind of graphic suggestivity, a different message in the way that I can, because I have these other sensory forms available to me as we communicate. So you don't have the possibility of picking up the sensory data if it's not there. If I give you a piece of paper with the word hello written on it. By the same token, you have a different experience when you're capable of noticing what's there sensorially than you do if you're not capable of noticing what's there sensorially. So for some people, even though they're in the presence of me saying hello, it's as though I handed them a piece of paper with the word on it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Because they're relying upon language alone, and they're not, they basically dumbed down.
They don't have the capacity.
Shut
They
down.
don't have the capacity to
muted
notice
the capacity to experience sensorially.
Right. We can argue some of it may be organic. They literally don't hear tonal change.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it may be experiential learning. They don't hear the tonal change.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Some of it may be they're in their own head processing so much information that even if they hear it, they don't recognize or acknowledge that they heard it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? A lot of what goes on in human experience is that people are some moments away from the experience they're having in the past or the future. Right? So I walk in, I go, hi, hello. Let's get to that report we have to do. And you're so fixated by the way I said hello that you can't pick up the sensory change in let's get that report we have that's due. So some moments in the past. You're peeling the orange and you're so intent on eating it and experiencing the pleasure of eating an orange, you don't notice that you're peeling it. You're some moments in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Most people live some moments in the past or some moments in the future. Very few people live in the moment they're actually having.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the second step that we can call perception.
Okay.
So even if you're capable of noticing for the sensory information, and even if you do, let's say at some level, notice the sensory information, perceptually, you're somewhere else. Mm-hmm. You're perceiving it differently.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Once perception is present, whether you're a few moments before, you're in the moment itself, or you're a few moments after, or you're 10 years, in the past, or 20 years in the future, it doesn't matter. Once that perception has happened, you're having your perceptual experience, including all the information you're picking up as well as all the information you're missing. You make sense of the perception. Okay? So I give an example all the time. I say, I'm walking in a field and I see a tree. Now, there's my sensorial capacity. What do I actually see? How good is my eyesight? Can I make out the shape of the leaves from where I'm standing? Or is it just a mass of green on a mass of brown sticking up out of the ground? Right? So I have a quality of vision, which literally is organically limiting my ability to see what's there, to take in the sensory data. From that, I have a perception. The perception is what it is I'm experiencing when I see whatever I'm capable of seeing. Now there's another step forward, which is I make sense of it. I can go somewhere between, oh, that's a tree, to, oh, that's an apple tree, to, oh, that's an apple tree in bloom, to, oh, that's an apple tree with apples on it, to, oh, that's an apple tree with ripe apples on it, ready to pick. Get it? That's sense making.
Okay.
So my perception immediately flips over from, there's no pause, in other words. As I perceive things, I'm already making sense of them. Mm-hmm. There's virtually no pause.
And I would use the word like adding descriptions and telling a story about. Is that correct?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. I'm just sensing what it is.
Mm-hmm.
I'm aware that I've sensed a thing in particular. I recognize, there's a recognition, let's call it.
Okay.
Not yet interpretation, just
Mm-hmm.
recognition.
Mm-hmm. And
Okay.
recognition is the same as perception, right?
I recognize right now that you're saying words. I recognize those words are intelligible to me before I even know what you said. I can hear that these words are recognizable to me. If you start speaking Russian, I'll be able to hear you're saying words and they're not recognizable to me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know yet that you're speaking English. I don't know yet that you're speaking Russian. I haven't gone that far yet. Once I go, oh, that's English. Now I have sense making. Doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean it's bad. I don't have a feeling about it other than I know it's English. Now you can argue at the limbic level, I have a greater or lesser sense of comfort about things at this moment. I may feel more comfortable with you if you speak English to me than if you speak Russian, which I don't speak. Okay? The next level is, oh, you speak English. Now I'm going to begin making meaning. This is where meaning making comes in. Right? You must be American based on your accent. I've just made meaning of what I've sensed.
Okay.
It's English with an American accent. Therefore, it means I'm probably talking to somebody who's an American. Versus if you spoke English with a South African accent, it must mean that I'm talking to a South African person.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
The distinction between sense making and meaning making.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're speaking Russian, we won't understand each other, and therefore we probably won't get along. Even though when I say to you, sorry, I don't speak Russian, you immediately change to perfect English. I've already begun to make meaning based on the sense making I have of your speaking Russian. Now I have to change if I'm capable of changing. But there's already a limbic predisposition, we won't get along. I have less inclination to be comfortable with you than I did when you started speaking English.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So meaning making. Meaning making is where all these interpretations come in. What does what I now know I sensed mean to me?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a tree. It's an apple tree with ripe apples on it. That means I can pick one and eat it, and I'll feel better because I'm hungry now. That's meaning making. Get it? And the quality at which I do each of these things is really powerful. Again, any one of these transitions could be multi-hour conversations.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, once I've made meaning, I take a decision. I will pick the apple or I won't pick the apple.
Mm-hmm.
I will continue to speak to you or I won't continue to speak to you. I'll walk away or I'll stay in the conversation. That's decision making.
Mm-hmm.
Decision making is a distinct step which is separate from action taking. Deciding to pick the apple isn't picking the apple.
Mm-hmm.
So decision making leads me to the point where I do or don't take the action I've decided upon. So this process is all built into narrative. At each of these steps, there's a story that is there. It's a ripe apple tree. There are ripe apples on that tree. I'm hungry. I want to pick one. Pure sensorial response would be walk up to the tree, pick the apple, bite it, satisfy your hunger. Right? But it's on private property. Therefore, I really shouldn't. That would be like stealing. Stealing is wrong. So maybe I'll just go hungry for a while longer until I find something I can eat, which wouldn't be stealing. That's a story.
Mm-hmm.
That's got nothing to do with the sensorial form. Those are the social impositions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, somebody who's very creative goes, oh, it's an apple tree. It's on private property. Those aren't my apples. But I'm really hungry and I have money in my pocket. Maybe I'll just pick an apple and I'll leave the money, on the tree. I'll nail, the $2 of my money onto the tree. I happen to have some nails and a hammer with me. I don't know why you have nails and a hammer with you, but as my example. But the point is that when you're open and operating at a purely sensorially driven model, you have an aesthetic awareness, your creativity tends to increase dramatically.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because you can stay with the sensory form without all of the social inhibitions of right, wrong, good, bad that are attached to it. Right? And one of the cautions I have as we're coming around the corner to the end of this particular conversation is when your sensory experience, when your sensory capacity, your aesthetic filters are much more highly developed or evolved than people you're interacting with, that alone will create conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So do not try, as you develop this sense of freedom of your own aesthetic experience, to impose that aesthetic experience on others who are not capable of getting there.
How do you operate with those others?
You have to be able to use your aesthetic filters and your aesthetic experience to recognize what is most likely to be true for them in the experience they're having. Meet the people where they are.
Mm-hmm. So you continue having your own experience at your level.
Mm-hmm.
You also utilize your ability to perceive upon the people you're interacting with, and then then you have a facility, a flexibility to
Correct.
meet them where they are.
Right. There's a famous cyberneticist, von Forster, and he made a comment that the cybernetic imperative is to always increase choice. And in essence, what he's saying here is that if you're applying a cybernetic form of thinking, a systems model of thinking, its intention is to constantly increase choice. The biological equivalent is the law of requisite variety. In any given environment, ecosystem, the species with the greatest variety of ability to survive will be the species that survives the best. If there's a species which can only eat one particular plant that grows in that environment, if there's a shortage of that plant, the species cease to exist. If there's another species which can eat any plant that grows in the environment, it doesn't matter if one plant, becomes endangered and extinct.
Mm-hmm. So that's describing a flexibility of ability to operate. And let me just ask you to clarify. When you first described meeting others where they are, it conjured up the sort of dumbing down feeling within me. Like, do you have to dumb yourself down to meet people where they are?
In a way, you could say it's dumbing down. It's choosing to limit the amount of sensory information that you're sharing with the other person, not that you're necessarily responding to yourself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So in that way, if you want to call that dumbing down, I don't care. But it's not so much that you're dumbing down as much as meeting the person where they are.
Okay, so you yourself are not dumbing down. You're just kind of using a funnel, perhaps, to limit the number of
Right.
things you perceive in what you share to the
I'll give you the closing comments.
Mm-hmm.
I used to train dogs. When I was training dogs, I would go into homes and people would have conversations with their dog. They would go, "Buster, I don't know why you're peeing on the living room rug. It's so inappropriate. I give you high quality dog food. I take you to the groomer. We care for you. I even let you sleep in bed with us, Buster. Why would you continue to pee on the floor?"
Mm-hmm.
The dog hears, "Buster, blah, 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 Buster, blah, 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 Buster, blah, 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 Buster, blah, bluster, blah, 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 Buster."
Mm-hmm.
That's what the dog hears.
Mm-hmm.
Buster. All that other words are irrelevant for the dog. Okay? And the person is having this conversation at this level that's incomprehensible to a dog.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want the dog to do something, you have to translate your experience with the dog into dog. You can't expect the dog to translate its experience into human. It can't do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean? It means, why is Buster peeing on the rug? Is it preferable for a dog to pee on a rug versus peeing outside on the lawn? No. It means that you probably haven't taken the dog out for a walk in a reasonable time frame related to its need to urinate. So when you give the dog water, wait a reasonable period of time, 10 to 20 minutes, and take it outside so it can relieve itself. Build a habit pattern, and Buster won't pee on the floor, and you won't have to talk to Buster in philosophical terms. Now, if it helps you to read Kierkegaard out loud when your dog's in the room, that's great, but don't think you're doing it for the dog.
Okay. Joseph, can we went into extraordinary depth and detail today. And you did break down basically this sequence that fits inside the narrative. Can you kind of scroll back out to where we started? Like, make it all sort of fit, in essence, together with the original point that we were describing of the resolving the great trauma?
So can I fit 30 years of experience into the next 30 seconds? Of course, why not?
Of course.
So the great trauma, just to repeat what it is the break from our awareness and presence to our direct sensory experience. And the way that gets superseded, imposed upon by a social narrative.
Uh-huh.
How we're supposed to behave, what things are supposed to mean, that become more important to us than what things actually are for us. And only by going through this process we've begun to describe can we get back to the essence of the sensory experience and essentially re-find ourselves. Can we begin to then relate to what is essential to us as we know ourselves to be before all of the social imposition.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And to use just a quick phrase that I apply to this, it's the reality of beginning to once again have your experience,
Mm-hmm.
not the experience that you were taught and told to have.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it relieves all of this existential angst. It relieves all of the ontological angst. It relieves the mythological angst.
Mm-hmm.
Because all of a sudden now what you're experiencing, you recognize again to be real, and you can respond to it for what it is, not what it was, not what you want it to be, and not what you're told it should be, could be, might be, or even is. It simply is what it is. And if you don't like spinach, you get to choose not to eat it, even if it's good for you.
Thank you so much for another extraordinary conversation, Dr. Joseph Riggio. And I do have a purple kiss for you. And I hope we can continue this conversation with the depths and dimensions that have been opened up here, the wormholes. We will continue traveling down those wormholes in future conversations. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. See you soon.
Great. See you soon.